Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, boys and girls, before the term influencer became a thing, they were called radio DJs. And it was a lot cooler to be one of those, at least from my perspective. I guess I'm showing my age, but if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with once more, as always. My name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast, where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and conversational fashion, because that's how we do things around here. And if you like how we do things, I'm assuming you do, you're listening to us right now, you can subscribe to the podcast. You can do that over at Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts. And also, we archive every single one of our episodes over at our YouTube channel. Also, we'd really like it if you'd follow us on social media. That'd be great. You can do that at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at either at In The Seats or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of updates. And finally, and I do dare say, most importantly, please pay us a visit over at In The Seats, intheseats.ca for all the latest and greatest movie news, reviews, and anything else in between from the world of entertainment and beyond and the moving image and all that sort of fun stuff, because we love writing about it and talking about it, and we love it when you read about it. So please pay us a visit. We got an interesting one on this one. We're diving back into the vault a little bit. We're looking at some stuff that is on a variety of different services. I think it's on Tubi right now, and it might be on Prime in the States. It is a documentary called The Glamour and the Squalor, and it's a good one. It's an interesting story of back in the early 90s when, radio DJs were breaking scenes and sort of making bands. And director Marq Evans takes us into the life of the legendary Marco Collins, who really helped shape a generation because he broke bands with the likes of Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Beck, Chemical Brothers out of the Seattle music scene. And he's an interesting guy, but he's waged some battles too. He's had his battles with addiction and struggled to come to grips with his sexuality and coming out and all that. And it really takes us into sort of the scene of early 90s Seattle to see all this music kind of forming and bubbling up, but also how the lifestyle, especially at that time, could definitely sort of overwhelm people. And it almost did with Marco, but it's a fantastic story, and we got the chance to talk with director Marq Evans about it. And it's a really interesting thing to just sort of get that glimpse back onto history, and especially sort of the music history of the early 90s, where so many influential and huge bands came out of that scene, and we haven't seen anything like that happen since. And it's an interesting little time capsule, and if you're a music fan, I think you'll really get a kick out of it. But definitely check out The Glamour and the Squalor, which, like I said, it's available on iTunes, but and you can find it on places like Prime in the States. I'm pretty sure it's on Tubi up here in Canada. But give it a shot, and give a shot with our talk with Marq Evans, because it's a good one. I think you'll enjoy it, because I know I did.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Mark, man. Thanks for the time today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, I mean, obviously, congratulations on the movie. But, I mean, I guess my first question is, how did this idea kick off? Because, I mean, he's such a fantastic subject. I've got to imagine it's just a question or were you in the scene? Did you know of him? What was the initial idea?
The initial idea came, this is way back in 2011, the End radio station, 107.7 The End, which is still on Seattle today, a commercial radio station. Back in September 2011, they were having a 20-year anniversary of their radio station. So I guess this September will be their 30-year anniversary. But and they had all weekend long, they had a show where they were counting down their top 107 songs from the station's history, which I'm sure Smells Like Teen Spirit must have been number one. But then they would have the radio DJs, the famous radio DJs, come and tell their stories. And every time Marco would come on, it was just this epic story. His personality was so engaging. And this was at a time where I wasn't really listening to radio. I just kind of happened upon it because I was somewhere where I couldn't get my satellite radio wasn't coming in, and it was the only radio station that I could even get. And I would find myself like waiting. I'd go get groceries and I'd come back and I'd be waiting in the car, like listening to these stories. So it was just really interesting and it grabbed me. And Midnight in Paris, the movie, the Woody Allen movie had just come out, and I kind of was thinking like, oh, maybe this could be a fun story. Like kind of like a Midnight in Paris, except for it's 1991 Seattle, where all these bands are taking off, and there's this radio station that's right in the middle of it. That was kind of the initial thought, and that maybe I'd write a script based around like the most famous radio DJ there. So I was like, okay, who's that? Oh, it's this Marco guy. And so I didn't know anything about him. But not that long before, an article had been written about him in the Seattle Weekly, and it just kind of was his whole story, his kind of his rise and fall. And I thought, and I was like, oh wow, this is a really interesting story, and he's still alive and around. So maybe this is a documentary. Maybe it's not a narrative film, because everybody's still around. And that's kind of how it all started. And actually, the ironic thing is the guy that wrote that article that I found, that kind of I realized could be the basis of a movie. He's now my next door neighbor. But yeah, it's funny how it comes full circle.
Was Marco on board to this idea? Because I mean, obviously, you could have made a film just about sort of the glossy rock and roll high points, but you showed the highs and the lows. Was he on board for the total package?
Yeah, I mean, it was probably like 6 months of meetings and conversations before he signed on and said, yes, let's do it, which I'm glad he did that. And I'm sure he is too, just to make sure that he was totally ready to. And then once he said that he, was ready to do it, he gave it his all. He put everything out there. And I think that's what makes it such an engaging movie. And people really like, watching Marco's story, because he is vulnerable and he doesn't really hold back. And I think it helped that article had come out, which really detailed the highs and the lows of his career. He mentioned that when that article came out, he spent like 2 days in bed, just like so nervous to face the world, because it was actually kind of the first time he ever came out publicly as gay. And so I think because he did that, he went, it's certainly much deeper, I think, in the film, but because he had that experience of already being, doing this thing publicly, his life story, I think that really helped him make the decision to go ahead with the film.
No, I mean, obviously, to sort of make this right, you have to sort of dive into the music. And I've got to imagine sort of the research on this one was probably a fun one. Can you walk me through just sort of how much sort of deep digging you really had to do to sort of understand not just the scene at the time, but how it unfolded?
Yeah, because I was, I grew up in Eastern Washington, in Richland, Washington, small town. So I didn't, I was 4 hours from Seattle, and I was also 10 or 11 in 1991. So I loved this music, and but I didn't know really what the scene was all about. So that I had to learn from him and from others, and interviewed a lot of music industry people, musicians, and to make sure that we got the story right. But it was so fun, because I mean, there was times I would just get caught in a rabbit hole, like, on YouTube or whatever, just watching music videos and live performances, like, Pearl Jam in 1991. And I would just spend, all of a sudden, like, hours went by, and I was like, oh, I didn't actually like do any work. I was just watching these music videos. But it was, it was super cool to be able to interview musicians that I've been a fan of since I was 10 years old. And, Mike McCready from Pearl Jam did the original score. So sitting in his home studio as he's recording the music, I mean, that was just kind of all a dream come true.
No, and I mean, it's the stories that I think that really sort of struck me the most, just sort of the almost Wild West nature of the music business sort of back then, especially with radio. And I mean, not to mention, I mean, the drugs and sort of everything that was going on aside, just like the Vitalogy story just made me howl with laughter, just because it's one of those things that you absolutely believe. And how did you go about just sort of unearthing the stories? Was it just sort of knowing a guy who knows a guy, or were people coming forward? How did they all sort of coalesce together?
Yeah, I mean, with interviews, I always ask at the end, like, who else do I need to talk to? Like, I mean, I think you kind of talking to Marco, who was very involved in the making of the film, and he, during his interviews, we learned a lot of these stories, and we spent, probably 20 hours worth of interviews. So we were able to kind of, if we didn't hear a story this one day, the next time somehow it would come up, and I would always try to like ask questions where we could, from different angles where we can get different stories. And then so that it started with just a list of people that he thought we should talk to. And then every time we talked to somebody else, I'd ask, who else do we need to talk to? And sometimes you'd hear the same names, but every once in a while you get a new perspective. And, we talked to rival radio DJs, and, radio was so different back then because it was the only way, that and MTV were like the only way that you'd get music. Right now, you can get it anywhere. So it was just so much more important then. It was so significant then. So you had these stories like, you referenced the Vitology, or when he's leaking in utero. Those were like big deals. That was a big thing, that millions of people that are listening are hearing this music that, as he says in the movie, that we're not allowed to hear. But yeah, I mean, I didn't know any of the stories going into it. And so that would always be so fun when you're hearing a story like that. When you're doing the interview and you just know like, oh, well, this is going to be going in the movie, and you can you're already, as you're interviewing the subject, you're like editing it almost in your mind. And so it was definitely a lot of fun to hear those stories.
I mean, something else that I really felt was important in the film was, while we're tracking like pop culture and we're seeing sort of the evolution of the music in the time, but we're seeing how not just the music didn't just matter culturally, but it mattered socially as well. It's like, even from like sort of the referencing to Ryan Lewis and Macklemore and sort of having those moments out there, how important was it to sort of not just show sort of the trajectory of the time, but I guess maybe sort of the significance of it as well, especially when it comes to music.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm assuming you're, a big music fan.
Yeah.
And any of us that are, it's like we all have songs that have been so important to us and maybe helped us through tough times or whatever. I mean, music is just is important and significant. And so I think, in the film, Marco struggled with his identity, certainly when he was a closeted man, and which he really was, throughout, this time period of the film. And the music at the time that was most popular was pretty homophobic type of music, and when you're talking about like Skid Row and those bands. And so he's having to navigate that. And then somebody like Nirvana and Kurt Cobain come around, and he was able to see like, oh, these guys, these guys are like me, and they're, the opposite of homophobic. And they're saying, if you are homophobic, you can't come to our shows. And so, I mean, so not only did he love the music, but the message and like what it represented helped him. And, obviously millions of people like him all around the world. And then going forward to when Same Love comes out again, Marco, he hadn't even been, I guess he came out publicly, but not long before that. And, clearly you see in the interview when he's interviewing Macklemore, like he's still struggling with that. And especially as it relates to his dad. And, but music, I mean, it's just so impactful. And when you can have a great song, but it also has a great message, then, to me, that's just like a home run.
I love how the film also, it's almost looking ahead a little bit, because it really does touch on sort of the issues around curation and sort of the need for that. And I mean, it's something we're starting to see, especially in the film industry now, how we're kind of losing that. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, how important is not just the art of curation, but how do you think we can even apply it going forward? Because like you say, just the way media is presented out there, it's sort of put out there and this big splash of, boom, here's content, more content, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's crazy. And things get lost because, good content gets lost because of the lack of curation. And, I'm wearing this shirt, Aquarium Drunkard. I don't know if you're familiar with that website, but it's a music website. And he plays music from all genres and all eras, really going back, 50s to today. And it's just everything he plays. He's got a station on Sirius XMU. He has like a weekly show, and I love tuning into it because every time I listen, I'm taking like screenshots of the songs, and I just trust that guy. And there's a website that actually I don't think exists anymore called theworldsbestever.com. And it was the same kind of thing. Like he just curated like the coolest stuff on the internet, and I would just love going through it. And I don't think there's enough great curators out there today. Just people or organizations, whatever it is, that you can trust, like whatever they've got, I'm going to like. I think there's some film festivals that do that for sure. But I don't know if any of the streaming platforms have really done that for me yet, because there's just too much business at play too. When when you've got the financials in there, you've got to be streaming stuff that people are going to watch and pay for and it's not just about I mean, Criterion, I guess, would be, somebody that does that well.
Yeah.
But no, it's extremely important. I don't personally have any, answers forward thinking. I just hope that there's more great curators that can kind of break through. But when you're, it's like the art versus commerce side of it, though. Like, how can you, curation, I think, is totally an art, but how can you do it and curate great things, but also be like financially viable as well too?
It's the eternal debate that will rage on forever.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, how does Marco sort of look back on, I guess, maybe more of the Wild West days? Because while on one end, you can see sort of the creative juices flowing and the work that he's doing and the bands that are being broken and sort of the great stuff that he's pushing out there into the universe. But on the flip side of that, in retrospect, you've got to be able to at least see that, yeah, maybe that wasn't the healthiest of lifestyles at the same time. Like, how does he sort of balance that now?
I mean, I think he's in a much better place now than he has been, in his adult life. He's been sober for 3 years. He's back on the radio. He's on KEXP. I think there's another kind of bigger job too that's coming his way. And part of that is just, you get older and course, you take care of yourself a little bit better. But no, I mean, he was definitely in the scene. I mean, I don't think that was common for a lot of radio DJs to be like, especially commercial radio DJs, to be in the music scene and hanging out with the bands and things like that. And they just really liked him, and they kind of saw themselves in him as well too. But he definitely fell into that rock and roll lifestyle. There's no question about it. But what I've always been impressed with him, though, is that like he's never just tried to like live off of what he did in the 90s, and actually he's been opposed to that. He's been not wanted really hardly anything to do with that. And I think now maybe he's realizing like, okay, I can still be into new music and trying to share new music while also not reliving, but also he's got an experience and knowledge of that era that not that many people in the world have. So the world wants to hear that from him. So I think he's finally now opening himself up more to like telling those stories again. But it doesn't mean that he's got to give up on finding new music, because that's what he's really passionate about. And, you see that towards the end of the film. And still, if you talk to him today, it's all about this new band that he just discovered.
No, and you're right. I mean, it does have that right balance of sort of acknowledging what was, but focusing on what is and what will be, which is ultimately the more important and more healthy thing.
Yeah. And there's no reason you can't do both, right?
Well, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, I'm kind of curious, because correct me if I'm wrong, this was your first film, right?
It was, yeah. Yeah.
Why was this the first film? What was sort of the kickoff to make this one the first one?
Yeah. I remember ever thinking like the first film has to be a certain thing. It was just I had started making a documentary. So going way back after college, I spent like 7 years working in sales and sales management and hating it. And my brother was in the film industry. He made a movie in like 2006 called Americano that had Dennis Hopper and Josh Jackson, and was doing all kinds of fun things. And we ended up, I basically quit my job in like 2009, and my wife and I went and traveled a little bit. And then when we got back, my brother and I went down to Haiti and have been making a movie actually there ever since. It's turned into kind of like a Boyhood type film, which that ended up being my film school. And I just caught the bug. I just caught the filmmaking bug. And so I was just looking for stories, and this story caught my attention because, I mentioned earlier, like how I heard this, radio station, and then I read the article. And it was just one of those things where it's like, I felt like I've got to make this. I want to make it so bad. And then once you start making it, then as your first film, it's like, okay, whatever needs to be done to make this, I have to make this film. I have to complete it. It has to go out. I was scrubbing back through it today. And I couldn't believe like how much we shot, like all the footage we shot. Whereas my new movie, it's like a lot of archive, like almost the whole, it's interviews, but a lot of archive and only a little bit of new stuff. We made like most of this movie, like put it together from interviews to recreations to animation. And I just remember being obsessed with it, of like, just have to get this movie done, have to get the first one done. So I never really thought of it like, this is a great movie to be my first movie. Actually, it probably was not the right movie to be my first movie, because of just, it was just a hard movie, much harder than what I've done since. But once we got into it, I was obsessed.
But I mean, there is that sort of aspect of learning by doing, which is really almost feels like more of an invaluable teaching tool than sort of anything more academic or sort of, like book learning, just being like sort of boots on the ground and getting dirty and
Oh,
doing it.
I think I learned everything from an actual filmmaking standpoint. I mean, I shouldn't say that. There's still a lot that I have to learn as far as filmmaking goes. But as far as like making a documentary from the producing side, like everything that can go right or wrong happened. And so it was definitely, and it ended up, in hindsight, was a great experience for a first film because I just learned so much that I could, that I've certainly applied to all my work since and will continue to take forward.
There is this quality of in your film, and I think this sort of really comes out in Marco. Just there is sort of in hope up, like almost a hopefulness for the arts, because
Yeah.
we've seen so many stories in the past of people getting sucked into that rock and roll lifestyle or getting sucked into that Hollywood lifestyle, but maybe not coming out of it. But Marco seems to have, but is still existing in it. Like, and I'm kind of curious, looking back on the film now, how do you think the film sits sort of, I guess, on sort of a pop culture level?
Well, one, I wish it was more known on a pop culture level.
That's
I
completely
mean,
fair.
yeah, and I still kind of feel like, and it did what I was hoping it would do. It got out there, it played at festivals all over the world. It's available. People have seen it. I hear from people all the time that, Marco's story helped them get through whatever. So I don't want to, say that, but I do think that it will continue to maybe find an audience over the years because I do think it holds up and it will continue to hold up because of like what you said. It's the story of it's like a time capsule of this one part in music history, but also it's forward thinking and it's open-ended in a way too. But yeah, I don't know. I think that the music that he helped break is going to be with us forever. So I think
Yeah,
that,
for sure.
from Nirvana and Pearl Jam to Beck and Weezer, that music we're going to hear it in, 50 years from now, that music will still be important. And he was the guy that kind of pressed play on all of it. So regardless of where he ends up going with this story, which, I think there's still potentially, a second act for him. He will always be remembered for that. And I think that that's an important thing that will, remain important forever.
And I mean, I think really, especially with this film, that I think it really does highlight, like I was saying earlier, just about sort of the how awash we are in content, sort of the importance to just press play on something, to sort of click
Yeah, I
that
mean, because
button.
even then, like, this was, we think about now how we're watching content now, which we certainly are, and it's hard to navigate through. But you think about in the early 90s, especially like after I think Nirvana broke, there was so much money at that time with the record
Sure.
labels. I mean, they had so much money, and these record deals they were giving bands were insane because they were looking for like the next Nirvana or the next Pearl Jam. And so somebody like Marco, who was not just the kind of the main DJ, but he was also the music director. So he was really pretty responsible for everything that went on. And so he was, I mean, the amount of CDs and tapes that were sent to him from all these record labels, I mean, it was thousands that he would go through to find the things that he wanted to play. And, it wasn't even a record label that sent him Loser by Beck. It was, it was a friend of his from a different record label
Yeah.
that sent it to him and was like, check this out. He heard him playing at like a cafe and sent him the single for Loser. And Marco, was the first to play it on commercial radio, and Seattle loved it. And, the phones lit up and that became a mainstay. There's a story in the film about the Harvey Danger song, Flagpole Sitta, like Sean Nelson gave him the CD on the street, like ran into him and gave it to him, and Marco played it, and it took off from there. And I think part of it was this was great music that was probably potentially inevitable, but maybe not. I mean, maybe it had to come from Marco Collins in Seattle playing it for it to really take off.
No, and you're absolutely right. And there is such an importance to sort of being at the right place in the right time to be able to sort of push these things off. Because I could tell you the amount of pitches I get to do interviews every day, and I can't say yes to all of them, but I have to pick one who I want to talk to. And I just want to say thank you again for the time, and congratulations again on the movie. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks, Dave. I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on.
And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.